Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Dugout. In this episode, we have another amazing interview, and we actually just did the interview and we're recording this intro clip now. We did an interview with Kyle T. Mays. Jordan, do you want to give a little bit of background about who Kyle is and why I think you are especially interested in making this interview happen?
Yeah, he's a scholar of Afro-Indigenous history and culture, urban studies, contemporary social movements, and he's an associated professor currently at UCLA. And his work really bridges Black and Indigenous studies, exploring the intersection of race, settler colonialism, anti-capitalism, solidarity, um, and what resistance looks like and has looked like in the United States in different communities. He's an author of Afro-Indigenous History of the United States and the City of Dispossessions, Indigenous Peoples, African Americans, and the Creation of Modern Detroit. Both I highly, highly, highly recommend. And throughout his interdisciplinary lens, he interprets power, structure, and uplifts stories of solidarity, cultural resistance, liberation across marginalized communities. And I first found their work when I was walking through a bookstore in a city I will not disclose, going through shit I will not disclose, and I saw it, and this was in my era of expropriating books heavy, allegedly, and I just saw the book. There were so many signifiers about it that I was like, I need this. I don't remember how much it cost at the time, but I was like, this PWI does not need this. So I took it home and immediately delved into it, shared it with friends, and yeah, was really excited to finally have some FaceTime and explore some of the topics that have been on my mind since exploring the Afro-Indigenous history of the United States, but more excited to hopefully bring more folks to their work and around the conversations that they are having with themselves in the text and with their community, and the different kind of dialogues that means for us in decolonial futures. So very excited for y'all to get into this.
And I would say this conversation is going to be really useful for people that really want an entryway into looking at the intersections of Blackness and indigeneity and what are the different ways we can think about talking about it. What are the different modes of action that we can actually do to be closer to each other, to be in solidarity, to take liberation and decolonization seriously. So I would also recommend go to the show notes and get one or both of Kyle's books, because obviously if you listen to this, you should be learning more, and it should bring you to having more of these conversations in your life, figuring out what collectivism and community care looks like. So I hope this is an inspiring interview for people. Now on to the interview.
Hey everyone, we're excited to invite you to join us on Patreon. By supporting us, you'll be helping us keep the podcast going and make it possible for us to continue sharing Black radical ideas and history. On Patreon, you'll get exclusive access to reading episodes, where we break down important texts as well as early access to our guest interviews. Your support also helps us create more educational resources, like a website that will include educational modules about our episode topics and potential live streams. If you want to learn more and support the podcast, visit patreon.com/thedugoutpod. Every contribution makes a difference.
One of the first questions we usually ask folks is, what was young you like? What was your upbringing like? Could you talk a little bit about how you came up and how your childhood and those made the politics that you have now?
So I have four siblings, and I have an older brother, older sister. I have a twin sister and a younger brother who was adopted. I think when I was around like 8 or 9, somewhere around there. We grew up, people say poor. I always like to say po. Grew up very po. Welfare, those sort of things like that. I remember often trying to get just like various social organizations. My mom, like, hey, so I need you to say this because we didn't have enough food, so let's go to this local church to try to get food. Different things like that around poverty. I always remember being impoverished or going can only go to the grocery store one time a month, and so there'd be that big haul of groceries like at the first of the month, and then thereafter, we're scraping for food towards the end of the month. I don't have kids, but I would imagine it's like a lot of effort and time. I was also a good time too. I had an older brother who always looked out for me. I always had my twin sister around, so I'd make her go out with me and play catch and play baseball, stuff like that. So it was fine. Not too not you know there are certainly other issues, but it was always community oriented and often centered around my siblings very often.
Do you remember, like, what was one of your earliest memories? Because I know a lot of your work is about the line between or that connects, like, Blackness and indigeneity. What would you say is, like, one of your earliest memories of kind of beginning to navigate both of those spaces, or how did that come up for you growing up?
Oh, that's a great question. I think mostly, at least probably, I wouldn't say earliest memory, but most profound memory. You grow up knowing I was Afro-Indigenous. We didn't use the term like that back then. It was just Black Indian. I remember my older brother, because we shared a room, he had a book called Black Indians by William Loren Katz. And that book came out, I think, in like the late 80s, and there are different iterations that happened up until the 2000s. I was actually able to meet him in October 2019 before he passed away, I think like a couple of years later in New York City. But I remember picking up the book and I was like, oh, what is this? And my brother used to sing in powwows throughout the state of Michigan often. And sometimes I would go, sometimes I wouldn't. Um, and it was kind of the first time for me. I was like, oh, like what is this book about? It was the first time I had seen some sort of representation because while I knew my family was Afro-Indigenous, I didn't really think about it as an important identity marker. It was just what it was. And so there was a representation, but it's just family. But this is the first time outside of that I saw it within book or some other venue. And I was like, oh, it's an actual identity. That makes sense. So I'm probably 7 or 8 at the time. And then I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And that's really like a first marker that I can recall that was very profound to, I guess, my personal identity and education.
You revisited or reread that book very much?
Um, I reread it as an adult actually, and this was before I was able to connect with the author William Loren Katz. So I reread it and I was like, "This is not as good as I remember." But that's not even the point. It's not even the point. It was just profound to have these representations to me, which is why the book had a lot of meaning.
Interesting, especially trying to write through your own approach or framework to identity and the things you kind of pull from, whether it's like recent or further back in time. Because I remember when I was working on my first book, and like a thing that helped was going back to earlier texts to kind of both temp check the text, but also kind of revisit like that version of me that got so much out of it. I guess connected to that, is like when I was reading bits of your book in preparation for this, I was really interested in, I believe it was in the author's note that you wrote about how grad school, what in the author's note you said that grad school gave you the 5 years to reflect on yourself and learn how to be your fully Afro-Indigenous self. So could you kind of talk about the journey from reading like Black Indians to kind of discovering this fuller version of yourself while you were in grad school?
I'll start at undergrad. So I went to James Madison College at Michigan State, which is like a public policy school. Real nerdy ass kids. That's just like they're considered. They would call them Madison All Stars, which is always funny to me because these students were involved in everything, and I wasn't really one of those. Like I was a nerd, but not like I'm not doing all the corny stuff y'all are doing. And it wasn't corny. I mean, it was corny to me back then, but often you were put into having to choose between going to like this sort of black organization or this native organization. there was never a synergy between the two, and often I would vacillate between the two as an undergrad. And then just because of who I was hanging around, I ended up hanging way more around like black circles, just because. And my college is really small too, and I don't even recall another native student in there. Anyways, so it's a small school at Michigan
Wow.
State.
How
And
many how many students?
probably like 800 or 1,000, like
Oh,
total.
wow. Okay.
But they do everything they can in the first semester to like kick out all the black and brown kids, anyways. But I'm just competitive, so I was like, y'all ain't kicking me out. So going between those two different things, and then going to different graduations and ceremonies around that time, and when I got to grad school, you try to figure out what you're going to do research on, and I wanted to do more on Afro-Indigenous history. In fact, uh, now that I'm recalling this, one of the key moments that got me into this, even as an undergrad, I did a study abroad in Japan after my first year at university, and I wanted to do a research project. I learned about the Ainu, the indigenous peoples in the northern island of Hokkaido, and so I looked at that. And I started reading about it, and I was like, this seemed very familiar, like how Native people are treated in the U.S. So I would talk to my sensei, Aizawa sensei, and he just very Japanese, like stoically, just shook his head. No, he's like, it's not really important project, and they're kind of irrelevant people. Like saying this in Japanese was kind of like the summary and the vibe, and not that you can't question, but it's just like socially, like it's kind of rude to like go back and forth in a sense. So I was thinking Japanese. I'd want to be in Japan for a long time, and then it dawned on me there's more things I want to learn about and talk about in the U.S. around blackness, around indigeneity, and so then I ended up going back to the U.S. Fast forward, graduating, went to the University of Illinois. I wanted to do this project on the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement. And if there's anyone ever listening, there's still plenty of things to do around this topic. So someone please take this up. Like I'm sure there are many overlaps that have yet to be explored. When my first innocence there, I was, you go meet different professors. I was a Black Studies professor, and I was like, "Hey, I'm Kyle. I'm Black in Saginaw, Chippewa." And he goes, "Why are you ashamed of being Black or something?" I was like, "Oh, that's crazy." And this happened in undergrad too.
Ugh.
Crazy.
I mean, this professor is notorious, so whatever. It happened in undergrad too. Is a white professor, and I was like, I'm Black and Indigenous, and he said, "Oh, like being Indian is like a dying thing, so it's not really relevant." But this professor also introduced me to history of the Black Panther Party too. So talk about contradiction. But if I see him today, like we might have a problem.
As we should.
Like I haven't seen him, and I've been back in the college many a time, but we might have a problem if I see him. So, anyways, it got me identity wise to do the research around a topic and also explore way more about family history. You hear things, but sometimes you're not paying attention. And graduate school allowed me to really delve into family history with more intention and intellectually grasp the larger ideas around blackness and indigeneity.
Yeah, I was watching one of your talks earlier where you there's like a graphic that you pulled up of it's in my notes right now, but it's like just thought it was fascinating how you drew comparisons between like the historical circumstances, nation state relationship, nation state goal, all of those things. Cuz I feel like one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview is because I do feel like there's so much to explore and unpack. And I guess with my family coming from Jamaica, I think so much about how blackness can sometimes show up as this force of like replicating colonization in terms of like how we relate to indigenous folks, or that's something that's really important. And so when I saw that graphic about like I don't know, like the different relationships to these aspects of history and colonization. I feel like it felt like a really useful tool. And so I guess one of my questions is, in your work, through your research and like writing, or I guess maybe in your life, like could you kind of speak to the tension, I guess, between what many people consider indigenous communities and then like black communities, and how colonization can show up in either of those spaces or when those spaces are shared?
Yeah, that's a deep question. So first, I think it's important to recognize that we all live under capitalism, white supremacy, and colonialism, and they have impacted all of us in different and overlapping ways simultaneously. The foundation of the U.S., of course, are rooted in enslavement and dispossession. Impacts of those institutions, right? Anti-blackness, anti-indigenous, racism, and so forth. It's important to note, I think there are two forms of, we'll say, prejudice. There's certainly anti-blackness in indigenous spaces, a product, again, of colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism. There's also anti-indigenous, often in the form of erasure, so simply ignoring indigenous peoples within black spaces. Also a product of colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism. And from that basis, that's how I approach these conversations, because often people get into the "we've had it worse than you." I mean, I heard it just like a couple weeks ago in some space I was in, and I was like, "What are you talking about? This is not a matter of good, bad, worse, or whatever. It's just things happen, history happens, and there are continuing impacts today. It's just a matter of understanding how those things have impacted all of us today." Um, but in a very material sense, I think it can happen in reparation spaces. So I'm in California. There's a lot of tension around. One, there was a lot of momentum. There's a reparation task force that was put together during the pandemic 2020. There was a report that came out in 2022 or 2023. And they talk a lot about the legacy of slavery and enslaved black people in there. What's completely ignored, however, is that there was indigenous slavery in California as well. And to me, that's an example of a missed opportunity to talk about relationships and different forms of captivity, slavery, whatever you want to call it. And I like to think about it in terms of, how do we have conversations meeting on the land, whatever that could mean. So one of my good friends, Amber Starks, who goes by Melanin Muskogee on social media, we were at some event in Boston, and we did like a conversation interview between one another, and it was kind of the theme of this conference ended up being this conversation we had around, like, what would it look like to have a black barbecue, a native powwow, and have those things come together. Because you really can't. It's difficult to. One of my elders told me when I was having a dispute with someone, he's like, "Why don't you bring us some food and a gift?" I was so mad. I was like, "I don't give a damn about no food or no gift." But he'd do it, and when you feed people and you give them something, it sort of like brings that anger or tension down, way down, and then you can have a real conversation. So, in other words, how can Black and Indigenous peoples connect on the land in meetings in certain spaces? But we have to do it with good intentions as well. And I think that matters, the intentions, but you have to deal with the history of how people have related, because often we don't. People are afraid to have those very difficult conversations with one another. And what did queer Black feminist Audre Lorde tell us? Anything worth doing, worth achieving, must be difficult, not easy to achieve. It takes a lot of effort. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy at all. And we have to center the land and how people relate. I think Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael said it a long time ago. This is Indigenous people's land. So once we get that out of the way, right? So like even like the Caribbean, often there can be a lot of erasure of indigenous histories, peoples as well. And one thing, I don't like calling black people settlers, but it's like the same thing. You know, anyone can be anti-black, including black people. Clarence Thomas, right? Uh, anyone can reproduce and participate in the settler colonial project. And this is why we have to be aware and learn about each other's histories. You can be native and be like the biggest colonizer around as well.
Yeah, I feel like one of the big impetuses for me wanted to do this interview too was how you approached, like, I think actually near the end of the book and talking about the possibilities of Afro-Indigenous futures, you bring up bringing up new, like respecting and asserting sovereignty and rights to self-determination and having new relationships, agreements, and arrangements or whatever you want to call it. And that part really enticed me, and like, how does one navigate through that, especially in a place like the States, as a place so like you're dealing with so much erasure, like the amount of times, no matter who I'm talking to, I have to have a conversation which is like, yeah, but indigenous folks are still here, land back is still possible, and if you want to talk to me about reparations, you have to involve land back. In fact, I don't think the US really has the capability to stay and survive through true reparations. Means of like cookouts and powwows, but what types of like conversations do you feel like also need to be present, and questions that we need to have on our minds? Like, not that we need to have the full answers to these questions, but I feel like there are questions that we should have on our minds while thinking about such a convening. And I'm kind of curious, what are those that come to your mind for both Black and Indigenous spaces?
The first question is always whose land are we, depending on where you're at. Like, whose land are we on? And second, what kind of futures do we want to hold? And third, what does tribal sovereignty mean? Or we might say, what is decolonization actually? And I always think, so kinship. So I'll give an example. My family's Bear Clan or Makwa Dodem, and kinship for the Anishinaabe is how you relate to people, and it tells your responsibility to others within that system. We know historically that we created new clans for outsiders, and in that historical case, Europeans. So they would just be adopted into the, when someone got married, they'd be adopted into the family, and it explains their relationship to people. Tribal sovereignty. Sometimes people are going to get upset when I say this. It's just kind of liberal. It's just liberal sometimes. Often they see their destiny so tied up with the US. We're sovereign nations. I'm like, what does that mean? I mean, and for me, if tribal sovereignty could mean anything, using the clan system, whatever tribe, wherever local it is, whatever their kinship system works, why can't you then adopt, for example, black people in mass in the territory which you call your land or your home to have better relationships? Historically, my people adopted a clan, I believe it was a wolf clan, to as a form of diplomacy from another tribal nation. Of course, they weren't called tribal nations back then, but to deal with diplomacy, right? So if you can do that back then, often we think we need to recreate something different. The kinship system is right there, and I think it would behoove us to do such a thing, to have better relationships so we understand our responsibilities to each other, to the land, and to non-human species. And without those things, we're going to keep going in a circle of not relating, not understanding one another, and so forth. And decolonization, of course, I think it is. I know everyone loves decolonization not a metaphor. I think it is a metaphor for the authors, but also it has to include black people. Like, and it, black people have indigenous roots and customs that still persist, kidnapped from the continent. You still have African American English, spiritual practices, epistemologies, ways of knowing, thinking, and so forth. So until we kind of understand that, and decolonization has to be about returning land. It also has to be about ending capitalism. Or you can't just say, "Oh, land back. Look how much the government gave us, like a couple of acres back." Or let's say have a land tax. And I'm not even like explicitly knocking those things, but that's not decolonization in the way, because I think you should be strict with that term, right? Fanon would say what? Banishing it out of the territory. That's what decolonization should be, is that, which banishing that means banishing capitalism as well. And when people say, "I spoke my native language in this place," I'm like, congratulations for speaking your language. Shout out to you. That ain't decolonization. It just isn't. And I am someone who believes in language revitalization. My mentor is a linguist, so I believe in the importance of language. Let me keep that clear. But that ain't decolonization, though. Like, colonialism is still very much in the present.
How important do you feel like, because this is something, I guess, just to preface my next question, is like how, because I'm an anarchist, and one thing I always do is whenever I'm looking at histories from other places, I try to find the most anti-authoritarian, dissident history that I can in the place and be like, you probably don't have it 100%, but I'm fucking with y'all. And so someone and folks that I have really appreciated is folks like Klee Benali, who have like these takes around like what current structures exist now inside of like what we consider like tribal sovereign land and like the systems of that. And kind of touched on it before about like how some of the spaces can be very liberal, and I'm kind of curious, what is the extension of like in building those relationships, how much of like through what tools or pathways, and how much state involvement you see being possible, or whether it's more or like different like voluntary associated groups from Black and Indigenous and folks and nations coming together in those sort of avenues, or what kind of roles like pre-existing systems of relationships can currently be at play. So I feel like that's something that some people have in an issue with, not knowing who to talk to in these spaces, especially in Black spaces. So they're like, well, they don't even have their own government. So like, it's who do we really talk to in that way, versus these voluntary associations?
I mean, I believe in collectivism, but I mean, sometimes you have to start talking with the individual. Like, the kinship part still matters, and I'm not an anarchist, but certainly it would fit within this notion of anarchism, because it's about relationship building and building for a particular goal and point. Right, the land is still centered within that structure, and I'm always someone who believes in what are our goals, um, and who do, like, like, ideologically, right? There might be some slight differences, but do you fundamentally believe in all sorts of people's humanity, their freedom, right? I mean, even before colonization, we know, like, indigenous peoples had rules around, there was governing in a sense, but you had free will to do things. Like, that wasn't, it wasn't like you had to do these things in this particular way. It wasn't like an oppressive state structure, if you will. So you have free will to do things, and you have choices to do certain things. And I think the tools people need to understand is like learning about history and culture. Of course, from a materialist perspective, because we live in the real world, but those things still matter. And you know, it's often whatever networks one might have already. Go connect with those people and just see what they're doing, because often you like dig under the layers. You're like, oh, we're kind of doing similar things. Like, myself as a socialist, damn near communist at this point. When people say the older you get, the more conservative, I don't know how y'all got that shit fucked up. 'Cause that ain't true. This is getting worse for me. uh, right, but I think you have to find people who have similar goals, who want to see things end. I mean, for me, it's just Trans people are human. I mean, these are like simple things to me, but capitalism should end, colonialism should end, right? That doesn't solve all the contradictions. Once, I mean, we have real life historical examples of these things, and you still have to work out other contradictions. But who do I align with the goals, and then who in my network can I connect with to continue doing these things? And as a professor too, one of the things we need more of is getting back to reading groups. And I see it, student people don't like to read. And people are like, yeah, you use TikTok. I'm like, that's cool. Like, I'm not even mad at that. But your ass need to sit down and read. Like, there's no substitute for reading. It just isn't. Like, you can watch all the short videos you want. Like, I watch this stuff too. I learn random things on social media. Like, it's important, etc. There's no substitute for reading. It just isn't. And if I hear one more of my like black and brown students say, I want to read this white man, I'm like, what are you talking about? All your favorite activists that you consider icons, you know who they read? These random white people. And some of these random white people have good fucking ideas. So go grapple with them. And even if they don't, so what? Go learn about it. It's like history, theory, something. Grapple with it. You can't just call it out without.
That point, we recently did an interview with someone who talked a lot about social media and instant gratification and how that kind of bleeds into political processes. And so I guess I'm curious if you could like dig into that a little bit more because I do think that's a part. Like when I think about you talking about like what land are we on and how are we connected to the land, how do we convene in relation to the land, I think about how for a lot of like black folks in the US, like unless you're in a really rural area, like relationship to the land can be complicated. Like so many regions have been turned into urban epicenters and then that becomes like the site of a certain kind of carcerality. And in my mind, it kind of makes sense that people use this shorthand, but I guess in your teaching and the work that you do, how have you helped younger folks push beyond that? Is it literally like giving them the text and you see that light bulb moment, or do you think it takes more time, or how have you navigated that process of trying to push people to be more intentional and disciplined in that way?
I mean, recently I'm just like, well, back in my day, which isn't even that long ago, right? You know, I try to tell them to slow down. Go put your phone away, even for 30 minutes. Put your phone away, turn it off, whatever. Open the book and just read. It's not about getting like so many pages done. It's not about speed reading. And this, I mean, less so for class or political education. Because often they'll be like, you have any book recommendation? I'm like, yo, I'm dropping like book recommendations throughout the entire class. Just like write them down. This is what I had to do. I'm not creating a list for you. And there's another thing about note taking when people are. I grew up in a black church, so I can sit and listen for a long time. I mean, also, I used to like, I still love lectures, so like, I could still like sit there and like, man, like, oh, I didn't even know about that book. Like, let me write that down real quick. And it's a certain discipline and understanding thing and grappling with things that are hard. I mean, there's a class I co-teach. We have a bunch of TAs, and the TAs are pissed at me. The students are pissed at me because I assigned an article, and this is for first year students. Mind you, I'm someone that had to read Democracy in America and the Federalist Papers my first semester. So I have zero sympathy for first year students. Just not. I'm like, you don't get any sympathy. Like, sit down with some hard things and read. And it was about Huey P. Newton's intercommunalism. Somebody wrote an article about it. And, given the stuff in Gaza, everything else happening, I was like, well, they should probably like just think of more about U.S. empire. The class is about the U.S., but just think about U.S. empire and our responsibilities in the imperial core. And so I was clowning them like, oh, like there's a rumor like y'all was struggling reading this. And they're like, yeah. I was like, you know what you need to do? Go read it again. It's like watching a movie or your favorite show. You watch it, you learn something new every time. I'm like, this isn't. And you mentioned instant gratification. They think I should read it and the light bulb goes like that. That's not how reading works. Sometimes you have to read it multiple times and go, I think I kind of get it now. And then you got to go talk with people about it, right? So, like in a university setting, it's reading, then lecture, then discussion section. And that exists in the real world too when you're, trying to understand social phenomena. You have to really analyze it, read about it, think about it, talk with other people, argue with people, you know, in good faith to see what the outcome. Because I think they think, "Oh, I'm stupid." I'm like, it's not about being stupid. Like, drop that. This is not like you get a grade out of this, but I'm giving you real political theory that has mattered historically and in some respects matters today. So grapple with it and think about it. And you don't have to. I tell them often, you don't have to have answers. Often asking more questions after you read something, to me, is always a sign of like engagement. Because like, well, what about this? Let's talk about it. Again, it's not about, and you get understanding through dialogue. It's still community oriented. And they think, I read this once, I should be able to understand it and go get an A on this. I'm like, that's not how reading comprehension and critical thinking works.
Yeah, I feel like a text and process that really helped me understand that was being introduced to James Yaki Sales from like a political educator in the BLA who wrote this beautiful piece. Well, they wrote a lot of reflection pieces that were supposed to be study guides for like Victor Surge's about police repression. And then also one about Friends, Meditations on Friends Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And it's I believe the beginning intro of the section is, all right, you read the book once, now you have to read it again. Because I know y'all didn't understand it the first time, and because no one does. I haven't not read it. I've not talked to a single person that was like, "Oh yeah, I read this the first time and it was super easy." Not a single individual. Um, so I've really appreciated that companion piece too with that because it really helped me understand like study and how to like discipline my curiosity like towards an aim and a goal. Um so I always think that's beautiful. And I'm kind of curious with like the written language being so important and also with respect to language vitalization, I'm kind of curious in like a decolonial process, what is or how important are the ways that you see of like codifying knowledge systems? Like we've seen in Anishinaabe and Lakota spaces with like codifying law, like around indigenous law. Um, and I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that and kind of the ways that you think some of that should be or could be approached, and even if written language is the appropriate space for such codification, um, or archiving, I guess.
And it's a challenge. So even modern tribal nations are a product of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And so with that being the case, it's, they had to adopt these things in order to kind of move along. And part of it was meant to like stop random white people, corporations taking native land, but often there's no critical discussion of the limitations of the use of like that written law. And while I think it's important for kind of having to deal with the politics of right now, codifying those things in law, for example, people trying to utilize the UN's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and trying to draw on that as international law. It's not without its limitations either, right? It still, in a sense, upholds the U.S. nation state. It's not, and sometimes they're not critical enough to say we truly want to be sovereign. Now, of course, they can get smashed in real life because of the largest military footprint in the world, all the technology that they have, and so forth. So I'm not advocating for a sort of suicide mission, but I do think tribal nations could be way more critical and They're always in court. The various tribal nations are always in court trying to do different things, trying to hold on to the little bit that they already have. But when you have Nixon in 1970 talking about basically red power is red capitalism, and a lot of tribal nations are just like capitalist enterprises. That often that's what tribal sovereignty really is, in a sense. Look at our business models, and I'm like, I'm not saying y'all shouldn't have survived, but it's not an economics of collectivity. Although there's some things you might be able to learn about guaranteed income. Shout out to my colleague Randy Aki, who's studied that, the way you can learn from tribal nations with per cap and guaranteed income, as like a immediate means to help out people. But it's important. But what are more radical means of using the law? Like it's a limited structure, but it's like they don't ask that question. Um, One of my friends and colleagues, Matthew Fletcher, I'm blanking on the name of the. It's at the University of Michigan. He had like a cool piece on like using the traditions and cultures of tribal nations and using the United Nations as well, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to challenge the United States. And I think it's at least a good step to thinking beyond this nation state. Now, someone needs to do the next step beyond that. Like, how do we think beyond the nation states in general and outside of the very ineffective United Nations as well?
Yeah, I kind of want to pick your brain about that too, because I'm like, I something that I think gets erased through a lot of even like Black Panther history is their very like international political cause of going to the UN and still having the like a referendum on whether Black folks still wanted to be in the US or not, be considered citizens or even be citizens at all. And I think that's like a powerful political point to like that could have some resurgence alongside this sort of conversation. And I guess some of the questions is like, is that just having our own assemblies, having our own what would be called like, usually congresses or assemblies, meetings where we're able to have these conversations and nail out details. And then to me, then it's always a question of who. Um, so I'm kind of curious what kind of gears move in your mind in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because people act like they're people say black people are trying to be us. I'm like, no, there were actually at least a good amount of black folks who were thinking international, at least since the founding of the U.S., thinking beyond the U.S. nation state. They weren't even technically trying to claim indigenous land at all. Thinking of Pan African movements, critiques of global capitalism. Of course, not without limitations, but they were thinking beyond the U.S. and they did not want to call the U.S. home. And I think we need to get back to some of those instances, right, where you're trying to connect with people internationally, thinking internationally. Although, we got the ADOS and FBA folks now increasingly who are with the nice American flags on their Twitter handle, which is wild to me. You have that thing which it seems like straight out of the CIA playbook, and I'm like, oh, we were cooked as a community. I don't even know what to do with some of this stuff, but thinking internationally, increasingly as I gotten older, reading from Walter Rodney and many other people, of course, always thinks like, you know what? We have to focus on critiquing the U.S. empire and thinking beyond the U.S. nation state. And sometimes even I think tribal nations don't do that well enough outside of like the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and so forth. And what would it look like today for Black folks in the U.S. to engage further in that sort of dynamic as well? Of course, there are still Pan African groups around, but just more in mass.
I'm kind of curious, as like a researcher and educator, what have been some recent things, either or what have been some things that you've been researching that are like a gold mine to you that you're like, this is like it feels liberating to be able to either uncover or be a part of um being able to have this history and share it?
Oh gosh. Well, it's mostly negative, but I mean, it's very illuminating. So 2 years ago, I found that the Black and Latinx communities in Palm Springs were suing the city of Palm Springs for $2 billion for being removed and their property removed from downtown Palm Springs. That happened to be on the land of the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians who own this land in Palm Springs. And then I started looking into it, and I saw they were like, oh, they had an exhibit about this a little bit, and I also realized that the tribe hadn't really said anything about it. So I was like, what is that about? And so I'm just a boring historian who likes to find stuff out. So I go look in the archives for a couple of days, and sure enough, find it a congressional hearing in October 1957. The tribal chairperson, she is testifying before Congress saying, hey, we want to extend these land leases so we can have corporate entities come in and lease this land. In other words, the reason the tribe hasn't said anything about this lawsuit is because, in some capacity, they're in cahoots, even though some of their own tribal members are impacted by this. Because they wanted the land developed, like that's very clear. They worked with developers to at least have a plan. It sort of backfired on some of their people, which is why they don't want to comment on it at all. And at least intellectually got me thinking the tribe probably owes some of those Black and Latinx families around some of this thing. And what would reparatory justice look like outside of the gaze of white supremacy in this scenario? And I think that's difficult because the tribes they have all their legalities, they're very wealthy tribe and so forth. But they're only thinking about the financial responsibilities and not like what does reparatory justice mean here? And why do you only have to think about it in capitalist terms? I mean, I literally understand why, but like y'all can't think beyond that.
Yeah, it makes me curious in one of those moments of I'm like, there's still so much work and like foundational work to lay, and especially on like thinking of like different economic systems and how to have like that real proposal because it can't be loosey goosey when you're going to people who like this is survival. So like you were talking about how Nixon was saying those things about how like the red power was red capitalism. I think that was the same time that they were saying like black power was black capitalism. Like that same through line of then having the power movements and um all the different associations that were, I believe, like even beyond the Black Panther Party and AIM, like there were more other groups that were in community that maybe weren't as organized. But I wonder, I wonder where or how some of those relationships, or I guess, what are some like common grounds in those relationships that you feel like are good starting points for folks to have conversations around more communalist politics, and in how to in economic systems to move through. Because one thing I love about history is being able to like, yeah, a lot of it's depressing, but you can find like one or two things that are like, okay, but we have something shared, and something shared can be expounded on.
Yeah, so can't think of any good examples that I've come across between, for example, Black and Native people, especially around different forms of economy. However, like there are things, immediate things people can do now. Living in a co-op with clean people, though. I've seen the co-ops on the on the opposite end, and it wasn't it at all. I'm like, oh, and y'all chicken ain't cooked all the way through. That's a whole nother. The chicken was bleeding, y'all. The chicken was bleeding, and these poor white people were continuing to eat it, and I was like, oh, I'm getting out of here.
Yeah, I mean, they still exist. I like to tell people to start a commune, but don't always think of the old kind of communes because that's like some kind of I believe a lot of it's like anti-hippie, anti-communist propaganda, but there were the Mansons. I've had terrible food not bombs food. Like, don't worry, the communes, the shitty musty ones are still out there and
Yeah,
they're
I'm like,
thriving.
absolutely not. So there need to be some like hygienic and food parameters on these sort of commies. But like my friends in Chicago, they lived in a co-op in Logan Square for a long time, and it was cooperatively owned. I think it was like 3 stories, and it just made and the neighborhood is like being gentrified like crazy over the last I guess another for like 15, 16 years. but it was cooperatively owned. It kept like their prices low. I think everyone had like kids at some point growing up around the area as well. But like those are like immediate things people can do but don't really think about. You have your own space. They have their meeting. I think they have their meetings like once a month or something to talk about. Do we need to change the plumbing? What about this washer? So people have their own space. They live their lives like it is. In Chicago, of course. But like just trying to think things like that. I know there's mutual aid, stuff like that that's still going on, but thinking creatively about how do we try to benefit. Plus, we're very segregated still. How do we continue to form and just think differently about sharing certain things, even small individual things like you go out to dinner and in the US you got these big ass portions. How about we just split a meal, right? We don't like we're saving money right there. We don't have to get like two different meals. We could just split this meal or get a couple appetizers related to that. Sometimes it's like small personal things around the thing. If you have more money, you're paying for dinner and drinks, right? Like this is I mean, my mentor used to model this when I was a broke undergrad. And I was trifling because she would just like let me just buy like meals to go, so I'd be eating on those like dinners for like 3 4 days. But it modeled for me like just basic things that you should do if you're one of the more privileged, because some of the more privileged people can be cheap as hell. I'm like, oh, you got it right. Oh, you got the wings today.
And they have no idea how to talk about money, like in real terms. Like it's a real tangible thing that has like quote unquote value, but also then talking about how to devalue it and decenter the value and like value other things in our life. It's always positions of privilege that have some of the worst
And it's always
conversations.
wealth building. This would kill me about reparations too. Wealth building, cash payments. I'm like, y'all really love capitalism, don't y'all?
Yeah, this reminds me of the conversation that I've been reading this book, Commune or Nothing, that's like examining like the co-ops and then commune system in Venezuela and like the different developments and how they moved from co-ops as kind of seeing like a more collective property but not really getting rid of private property in the way that it like they were attempting to. So then like the existence of the communes were then like the networking of co-ops and housings in the neighborhood so that it was way more collectivized and socialized in a way that wasn't instead of then because this is something I get told as an anarchist a lot because they're like, "What are your economic things?" And I'm like, "Well, co-ops and communes and bottom-up federated structures." And they're like, "Well, that's not actually going to destroy capital's influence on your life." And I'm like, "I thought I was the anarchist. You wanted this shit right now? Like, I thought I was the immediate person." But like, I feel like it's a very eye-opening process for people to go through and have to, and like, it is still transformative and like just based on the like damn social and culture thing that we're in right now and recognizing what a social revolution takes.
People, you live in this capitalist system. If someone has the money and means, why don't you just buy X thing? Like, let people live there for as freely as possible, for example. That's to be about making money. Secondly, the right has all this like think tanks and it's so forth, influence policy. Where are the rich leftist people, the privileged people who got millions of dollars, whatever? I'm like, why aren't y'all funding these things? Like, I know all sorts of smart people who could just like pay us a bunch of money. We can help out communities. We can help think about like way more progressive policy in the interim. I'm like, y'all have no vision for anything.
Hey, hit my line. That's I know some people who are interested in the expropriation from nonprofit spaces, but also in the creating of those alternative seed money kind of thing of and how that can be used and expropriated from capitalist cycles with money and outside into building a whole new economy and even just like an economy of thought and how that gets valued um which I think is just like so very important. One of those things where it's like, damn, we have to look at that and be like, well, now we got to organize that shit. Like, ain't nobody else doing it for us. And it is not an individual thing, but it's something that you have to have patience for. Dealing with those fuckers, dealing with the nonprofit industrial complex, or even dealing with how we hold money and going through that internal like change with people is a process. It's a lot of emotional work. And but somebody's got to want to do it.
I think we just had a few more questions. I guess one question I had was especially about your book, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Curious what the process of writing that book taught you or what lessons it specifically gave you. Because I could imagine, I don't know what it like offers in terms of like literally just documenting that history, but how do you feel like it helped shape you as a person or a writer or like a political being?
For me, it got me thinking about more questions. And when you start talking with different communities, they always think like, so Black and Native people had all these interactions, and I show certainly some throughout the book, but like those are like the limited ones I could find. Like these things did not happen in a way that people like to imagine or project from their brain onto on this sort of thing. So to me, is it sort of went from trying to uncover certain histories, even reclaim certain histories, or put certain histories together like a puzzle, to trying to imagine and connect with people who want to do this work and just provide my intellectual advice and curiosities to them. So shout out to my friends Trevor Smith and Savannah Romero, who are the co-founders of Bliss, which stands for Black Liberation and Indigenous Sovereignty, and they're doing like really good work around movement building, narrative strategies, and so forth around this. And so for me, it led to like just more reflection about what are people doing today, what do people want to do, and it got. I was already a leftist at the time, but it pushed me further left to you just realize after writing it, thinking through it, I was already anti-capitalist, already anti-white supremacy, and so forth, but we have to do more to think about it. Otherwise, this coalition and solidarity is not going to happen. So for me, that's what probably changed more. And then thinking way more about the African continent and how come, and for example, in the Academy in Indigenous Studies, even notion of decolonization, they always ignore Africa. I'm like, y'all do know they got some decolonization happening in real time, right? Not without contradictions, but this influenced people around the world, and y'all just will cite Frantz Fanon, will cite all sorts of African thinkers, Black thinkers throughout the diaspora, and completely ignore the African continent. And it's just it baffles me. So like more diasporic consciousness that was there, but just like more directly thinking about it.
So I guess one of the last questions I kind of want to ask is if you want to drop, I love definitions. So if you just want to drop what decolonizations and reparations mean to you.
So decolonization to me is about returning land, ending capitalism and white supremacy and all the sort of social phenomena connected to that. So anti-blackness, transphobia, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean there are not contradictions within that. So if land was returned tomorrow and capitalism just collapsed, which I pray to God that shit happens, like tomorrow, that'd be great, right? That does not mean these other social contradictions, political contradictions, all of a sudden go away. And I think people just skip over that part. We want freedom, like, of course, but we're still humans. We still have social relationships, and we fucked with each other way too many times to like not have to deal with these things. I'm like, you can't even deal with them in your own family. Like, you think all of a sudden these things end and all of a sudden everything just gonna be cool? No, that's not how the world works. And reparations to me, it's about not necessarily repairing the harm done to Black people, but ending capitalism and holding the line on, I'll say, like restoring the humanity of Black people and other marginalized groups as well. Like that, it sounds kind of piecemeal and sort of immaterial in a sense, but it does matter. So, what kind of institutions, drawing on the past, can we create for our futures? Because repairing, people say repairing harms, kind of a typical definition. It's less about that, but projecting a future. And how do we put that future in practice without the vestiges of capitalism and colonialism, right? And build better community relations with like minded people that have impacted us in a lot of social, psychological ways that we often ignore.
Yeah. Are there any projects coming up that you want to highlight or tease for folks?
I just finished a book that
Where do you want to invite people if they want to learn more about your work and stay up to date?
people can hit me up on social media. I don't even remember my tags on social media, but I think it's Maze Kyle on one of them and like Maze_Kyle. I don't really post like too many things, but sometimes I just like talk shit on some of these things. But people can always send me a message. It's cool.
The Channel Zero network has some reminders on how to support those who have been arrested.
Arrests are one tool cops use to repress mass movements. Arrests keep protesters off the streets during demonstrations. They scare people with the threat of court cases and potential prison sentences. Alone, we feel defenseless against the police and the courts. By providing jail and court support, we can push back against this repression, from the moment our comrades are taken in to the end of their court case.
Before heading out into the streets, make sure you and everyone you're with has a contact number written on their body. You'll need to get in touch with someone if you're arrested, and you most likely won't have your personal belongings with you. This number can be the National Lawyers Guild, a group you're currently involved with, or just a friend who's not at the protest.
If you see someone getting arrested, call your legal support number with the arrestee's legal name and birthday. If you're in a large city, you may have to determine where they will be taken. Try to find the arresting officer's precinct or unit. This may determine where your comrade ends up. In smaller cities, everyone may go to the same place.
If you expect more arrests, try to stay and observe. If not, you should head to the precinct and wait for the arrestee.
Once at the precinct, use the legal name and birthday of the arrestee to ask the cops for the arrest number, charges, and where the arrestee will be taken or held. Keep anyone supporting you in the loop.
Be prepared to wait many hours. Keep in touch with others and take turns waiting outside the precinct. In some cases, it may take the whole night, especially if there's been a mass arrest.
From here, each city and state has different processes and different jargon. Connect with local organizers and read about local laws to learn what the process will be in your area. Here are some things you might encounter.
Sometimes arrestees are released quickly with a notice that they'll need to show up in court at a later date. If this happens, take the contact info of the arrestee. You'll want to be ready to offer them court support in the future.
Sometimes, arrestees are charged before release. This is a longer process, usually called arraignment, which is a procedural court hearing to file charges and set bail. The court will assign a public defender for arraignments. Try to have a couple of friends attend the arraignment for support. Due to COVID-19, you may only be able to observe via video.
Sometimes arrestees will have to post bail to be released. If bail is set, let the court officer know you're arranging payment and will be coordinating with the arrestee's lawyer. If you need support making bail, connect with local organizers. There may be a bail fund for protesters in your area.
No matter what happens, always relay what's happening to other people offering support.
Regardless of the legal situation the arrestee ends up in, you'll need to bring some things with you. People who are getting out may be exhausted or have trouble getting home. So bring snacks, water, aspirin, bus fare, transit cards, and cigarettes. If you have a friend being held, you can bring their favorite snacks. If you know the arrestee requires specific medication, make sure to bring that too.
You'll also need water and snacks to sustain yourself. Bring external batteries for charging phones as you may be waiting many hours.
If you can't stay and help with jail support, dropping off materials to those waiting can be a big help.
Unfortunately, there is a high risk of exposure to COVID-19 while in an enclosed jail cell. Arrestees should consider self-quarantining and getting tested.
For every street action and every viral video of arrests, there are dozens of people outside the spotlight supporting the movement. It's not over till everyone's safely gotten out of prison and everyone's beaten their charges.
Check out Rebel Steps jail support episode at rebelsteps.com/jail support for more tips and resources. The Channel Zero Network sends y'all solidarity.
Stay safe out there and never stop fighting for a better world.